June 26, 1944. Hollandia, New Guinea. Colonel Charles MacDonald is sitting down to a checker game with his operations officer when a middle-aged civilian in khakis knocks on his screen door. The man introduces himself. MacDonald doesn't quite catch the name and returns to his game. The civilian tries again, explaining that General Hutchinson sent him over to discuss P-38 combat operations. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. MacDonald looks up. The man standing in his doorway is Charles Lindbergh. The Charles Lindbergh, the most famous aviator in the world, the man who flew solo across the Atlantic 17 years earlier, is asking to tag along on combat missions over Japanese-held territory in the most dangerous theatre of the war. The 475th Fighter Group has been bleeding range and fuel for months. Every mission into Western New Guinea and beyond pushes their P-38 Lightnings to the absolute limit. Pilots are calculating fuel reserves down to the last gallon, turning back from targets because they can't risk the return flight. The official combat radius is 570 miles. That's the number in the manual. That's what engineering says the airplane can do with a 1-hour fuel reserve. And that number is killing them. Because the targets that matter, the ones MacArthur needs hit to push north toward the Philippines, are beyond 570 miles. Japanese air bases at Seram, Halmahera, eventually Palau, all of them sit just past the edge of what a P-38 can reach and return from. So pilots fly out knowing they're gambling, knowing that if anything goes wrong, if they hit unexpected headwinds or get into a prolonged dogfight or take damage that increases drag, they're swimming home. The twin engines help. Lose one engine in a single-seat fighter over the Pacific, and you're dead. The P-38 can limp home on one Allison if it has to. But that's cold comfort when you're 800 miles from base with your fuel gauge needle kissing empty and the Japanese-held ocean stretching endlessly below. Lindbergh's arrival shouldn't mean anything. He's a civilian contractor for United Aircraft, supposedly out here evaluating twin-engine fighter performance for Vought. He's been island-hopping through the South Pacific since April, flying Corsairs with Marine squadrons, making himself useful in ways that headquarters in Washington doesn't need to know about. But he's 42 years old. He's never flown a P-38 before arriving in New Guinea, and he's asking MacDonald if he can fly combat missions with the best Lightning outfit in the theatre. MacDonald is 29. His squadron commanders, Thomas Maguire and Merrill Smith, are 24 and 26. They're fighter aces, proven killers with dozens of Japanese aircraft to their credit. They've been flying P-38 seconds in combat for over a year, know the airplane's every quirk and limitation, and now they're supposed to babysit a middle-aged celebrity who last saw combat, if you can call it that, as a barnstormer 20 years ago. But something about Lindbergh's quiet confidence, his obvious mechanical knowledge, his genuine interest in how they're operating the Lightning, persuades MacDonald to take a chance. They agree Lindbergh can fly one mission, just one, to see what he's made of. If he can't keep up, if he's a liability, he goes back to whatever desk job United Aircraft is paying him for. The mission launches at 10:30 the morning of June 27th. 4 P-38 seconds. MacDonald leads. Maguire, Smith, and Lindbergh fill out the flight. The target is Salawati Island at the western tip of New Guinea. Enemy barges, supply vessels, anything moving on the water. It's a typical long-range strike. 3 hours out, 20 minutes of combat, 3 hours back. 6 hours in the cramped P-38 cockpit sitting on a parachute pack and emergency raft with an oar jabbing into your spine. Lindbergh slots onto Maguire's wing and holds perfect formation. MacDonald watches him through the whole flight. The civilian flies like he's been doing this for years. Smooth, precise, no wasted motion. During the attack run over Caibos Bay, Lindbergh picks a barge and walks 20mm cannon fire and 50 caliber tracers into it until it explodes, all while weaving through anti-aircraft fire, staying in position, conducting himself exactly like a combat pilot should. They land back at Hollandia 6 hours after takeoff. The crews swarm the aircraft to refuel and rearm, and that's when something unusual catches the crew chief's attention. Lindbergh's P-38 has significantly more fuel remaining than the other three aircraft. Not a little more, a lot more. Enough that it's immediately obvious something's different. Over the next week, Lindbergh flies 4 more missions. Same pattern, long-range strikes to Salawati, to targets along the western New Guinea coast. Every time he returns with substantially more fuel than anyone else in the formation, sometimes twice as much. The pilots start noticing. The crew chiefs definitely notice. And finally, MacDonald pulls Lindbergh aside and asks the question everyone wants answered. How are you doing this? To understand what Lindbergh was about to reveal, you need to understand what the P-38 pilot had been taught about his engines. The Allison V-1710 was a powerful, reliable, 12-cylinder liquid-cooled engine. Each P-38 mounted 2 of them in counter-rotating configuration, 1,425 horsepower each when running at war emergency power. But that power came with strict limitations. The engines were supercharged, compressed air forced into the cylinders to maintain power at altitude. That compression generated heat. Serious heat. If the intake air temperature got too high, the fuel-air mixture would detonate prematurely, destroying pistons and cylinder heads in seconds. So the P-38 used intercoolers, devices that cooled the compressed air before it entered the engine. The system worked, but it was temperature-sensitive. Pilots were taught to operate their engines according to specific power settings in the technical manual: engine RPM, manifold pressure, fuel mixture, all carefully calibrated to keep temperatures in the safe zone. The standard cruise setting for long-range missions was 2,300 RPM, with a specific manifold pressure setting, mixture-rich. That gave the P-38 its official 570-mile combat radius with reserves. That was the number Lockheed tested. That was what the Army Air Force accepted, and that was what was painted on the range card in every P-38 cockpit from Alaska to New Guinea. But Lindbergh looked at those numbers and saw something else. He saw conservative engineering, safety margins built on top of safety margins, designed to prevent the absolute worst-case scenario at the cost of operational capability. He'd spent weeks flying various fighters, studying their fuel consumption, talking to mechanics, analyzing what the engines were actually doing versus what the manuals said they should be doing. And he'd concluded that the P-38 could do better, a lot better. The technique Lindbergh proposed was mechanically simple, but psychologically difficult. Reduce engine RPM from 2,300 down to 1,600. Increase manifold pressure substantially. Set the mixture to auto-lean, letting the carburetor find the most efficient fuel-air ratio automatically, and cruise at 185 miles per hour indicated airspeed. This combination reduced fuel consumption from around 120 gallons per hour down to 70, about 2.6 miles per gallon instead of 1.8. The math was straightforward. Same fuel load, 40% less consumption equals dramatically extended range. 570 miles becomes 700, maybe 750 with good conditions. Suddenly targets that were unreachable become viable. Missions that required gambling on fuel margins become routine. But there was a problem. Everything Lindbergh was suggesting violated what pilots had been taught. The lower RPM, higher manifold pressure combination was explicitly warned against in training. Instructors said it would cause detonation, burn valves, score cylinders. Running lean mixtures at high power settings was asking for engine failure. The technical manual didn't explicitly forbid these settings, but it strongly implied they were dangerous. And now some civilian, no matter how famous, was telling them to ignore their training and trust him. MacDonald called a meeting. All 3 squadron commanders, senior pilots, the group's engineering officer. Lindbergh laid out his proposal. He showed them the figures in the Lightning's own technical manual that supported his calculations. He explained the thermodynamics, how lower RPM with higher manifold pressure actually ran cooler than higher RPM at the same power output because of reduced friction and more efficient combustion. He walked them through every concern about engine damage. The pilots listened. Then they raised the obvious objections. If you find this story engaging, Please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 7 hours in a P-38 cockpit was already brutal. 9 or 10 hours, which this technique would enable, was physically punishing. Your back seized up, your legs cramped, sitting on that parachute and raft became torture after hour 6. Some missions would require fighters to escort bombers all the way to targets like Balikpapan in Borneo, then fight their way home. 8 hours minimum. The human factor wasn't negligible. And what about the engines? The mechanics were worried. Sure, the math looked good. The temperature gauges supported Lindbergh's claims in test flights he'd already done. But if they were wrong, if running 1600 RPM with high manifold pressure actually did damage cylinders, progressively over time, they'd start losing engines mid-mission, over the ocean, hundreds of miles from base. The consequences wouldn't show up in test flights. They'd show up when it was too late. Lindbergh had an answer for that. The P-38 had 2 engines. If his technique damaged one engine, the pilot could shut it down and fly home on the other. Yes, that reduced your speed and fuel economy, but you'd still make it back. And more importantly, he argued, Allison was supplying spare engines faster than they could install them. Engine replacements were routine. The 5th Air Force had plenty of Von 1000, 710 seconds, sitting in crates. So the real question wasn't whether this technique might eventually harm engines. The question was whether potentially shortening engine life was an acceptable trade-off for missions that could actually reach critical targets and bring pilots home alive. Put that way, the choice became obvious. But intellectual acceptance and psychological acceptance are different things. These pilots had been drilled on proper engine operation. They'd lost friends to engine failures. The sound of an Allison coughing, missing, the sickening silence when one quit completely. Those were the sounds that visited you at night, and Lindbergh was asking them to deliberately operate their engines in ways they'd been taught would cause exactly those failures. The resistance wasn't universal. Some pilots, particularly the more experienced ones, understood what Lindbergh was offering. They'd been calculating fuel margins on every mission for months. They knew how often they'd turned back from targets or aborted attacks because their fuel state wouldn't allow them to press. Anything that gave them more range, more loiter time, more margin for error was worth trying. But the skeptics were vocal. A few flatly refused. It was one thing to let a civilian fly along on missions. It was another to fundamentally change how they operated their aircraft based on his recommendations. Some of the younger pilots, the replacements fresh from stateside training, were genuinely scared. They'd just learned to trust the P-38, learned to believe it would bring them home if they followed procedures. Now someone was telling them the procedures were wrong. MacDonald made the decision. The technique was optional. Any pilot who wanted to try Lindbergh's method could. Anyone uncomfortable with it could stick to standard settings. They'd evaluate results after a few missions and decide whether to make it group policy. Over the next 2 weeks, roughly half the 475th's pilots experimented with the new cruise settings. The results were immediate and undeniable. P-38 seconds came back from 7-hour missions with fuel reserves that would have required them to turn back at the 5-hour mark using standard settings. Pilots who'd been white-knuckling fuel gauges suddenly had margins, room to maneuver, options, and the engines didn't explode. Cylinder head temperatures ran slightly cooler, if anything. Oil pressures stayed normal. The Allisons just ran and ran, smooth as glass at 1600 RPM, eating up miles at dramatically reduced fuel flow. After 50 hours, after 100, the engines showed no unusual wear during teardown inspections. Lindbergh had been right. By mid-July, nearly every pilot in the 475th had adopted the technique. The other P-38 groups in New Guinea heard about it, sent observers, started implementing the same procedures. The word spread through the 5th Air Force like wildfire. That civilian, Lindbergh, the one flying with the 475th, he's figured out how to make a P-38 go 750 miles. General George Kenney, commanding 5th Air Force, heard about it through a war correspondent on July 4th. Nobody had officially told him that Charles Lindbergh was in theater, flying combat missions, teaching pilots to operate their aircraft contrary to technical orders. Kenny was simultaneously impressed and appalled. Impressed that Lindbergh had solved a problem that had limited operations for months. Appalled that a civilian contractor had been flying combat without proper authorization from MacArthur's headquarters. Kenny summoned Lindbergh to Brisbane on July 5th. The meeting was awkward. Lindbergh had technically been authorized by the Navy to visit the South Pacific, but not MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area. He'd just sort of shown up and started flying, and junior officers had looked the other way because, well, he was Charles Lindbergh. How do you tell that guy he can't fly? But Kenny wasn't interested in paperwork. He wanted to know about the fuel technique. Could it really extend P-38 range from 570 miles to 750? Lindbergh said yes. He'd personally flown missions proving it. The pilots who'd adopted his method were confirming it daily. The figures were in the Lightning's own technical manual. All you had to do was actually use the engine at its most efficient operating point, instead of the conservative settings chosen by engineers worried about worst-case scenarios. Kenny did the math. 750-mile radius meant targets in the southern Philippines became reachable. The Palau Islands, critical for MacArthur's northward advance, could be hit by fighter sweeps that had been theoretically impossible. Heavy bombers could be escorted deeper into Japanese territory with meaningful fighter protection instead of sending them alone. The strategic implications were enormous. This wasn't just a neat trick. It fundamentally changed what 5th Air Force could do in the air war. Kenny made his decision. Lindbergh could continue flying as an observer. Officially, he wouldn't carry weapons or engage enemy aircraft. Unofficially, if he happened to strafe a little, well, these things happen in the confusion of combat, and who's going to know? More importantly, Lindbergh would continue teaching his fuel management technique to every P-38 unit in theater, make it official policy. Lindbergh returned to the 475th Fighter Group at Hollandia on July 7th. By then, his technique had already spread beyond the group. P-47 Thunderbolt pilots were experimenting with similar lean mixture settings. Corsair squadrons were adjusting their cruise procedures. But the P-38 community embraced it most enthusiastically because they needed it most desperately. The Lightning's range had always been its greatest asset in the Pacific, and now that asset had just increased by 30%. The validation came in blood and distance. On July 28th, Lindbergh was flying bomber escort near Seram when his flight encountered Japanese fighters, a Mitsubishi Ki-51. The Allies called it a Sonya, a light bomber and reconnaissance aircraft. The Japanese pilot, Captain Saburo Shimada, a veteran commander of the 73rd Independent Flying Chutai, had spotted the American formation and was trying to escape. In the twisting dogfight that followed, most of the American pilots expended their ammunition. Lindbergh, arriving late to the fight, still had a full load. When Shimada's Sonya suddenly reversed course and flew directly at Lindbergh's P-38, Lindbergh reacted on instinct. It looked like a ramming attack. He fired. 20mm cannon rounds and 50 caliber bullets tore into the Sonya's engine. The propeller slowed visibly, but Shimada held his course, coming straight at the Lightning. Lindbergh pulled up hard at the last second. The damaged Sonya passed underneath, went into a steep dive, hit the ocean, and sank. One Japanese aircraft destroyed. Lindbergh's only aerial victory of the war. It was never entered into official records because officially he wasn't supposed to be shooting at anyone. But everyone in the 475th knew the civilian could fight. 4 days later, on August 1st, Lindbergh flew the mission that proved everything. 4 P-38 seconds from the 475th launched from Biak Island, heading for Palau. The Palau Islands sat 630 miles from Biak, round trip, over 1,200 miles, plus combat time. This mission was theoretically impossible, using standard fuel settings. Even with Lindbergh's technique, it was going to be tight. They flew out at Lindbergh's recommended settings, 1600 RPM, high manifold pressure, auto-lean mixture, 185 indicated. The engines hummed. Fuel flow stayed at 70 gallons per hour. They reached Palau with enough gas to fight, and fight they did. The other 3 pilots destroyed several Japanese aircraft on the ground and in the air. Lindbergh found himself with a 0 on his tail, couldn't shake it, genuinely thought he was about to die until one of the other Lightnings chased the Japanese fighter off. They headed home, 900 miles of ocean between them and Biak. Fuel gauges slowly dropping. They landed with reserves, not much, but enough that they weren't gliding in on fumes. A mission to Palau and back, 630 miles each way. It had been impossible. Now it was routine. General Kenny heard about the Palau mission and made a decision. Lindbergh had to leave. Not because of poor performance, the opposite. If word got out that a civilian contractor, a political lightning rod like Lindbergh, was flying deep penetration fighter sweeps and shooting down Japanese aircraft, the political fallout would be catastrophic. Plus, bomber crews in the 13th Air Force had been told for months that fighters couldn't escort them to the Caroline Islands because of insufficient range. If they found out that fighters could have been protecting them all along, there'd be hell to pay. He'd been with the 475th Fighter Group for 6 weeks. He'd flown 50 combat missions in total, counting his time with Marine Corsair squadrons. He'd shot down 1 Japanese aircraft, sunk enemy barges, dive-bombed enemy positions, been shot at by nearly every anti-aircraft gun in western New Guinea, and he'd fundamentally changed how the U.S. Army Air Forces operated its most important long-range fighter. The numbers tell the story of what happened next. In June 1944, before Lindbergh's technique became standard, P-38 combat radius in the Pacific was 570 miles with 1-hour fuel reserve. By September, after units had fully adopted the new cruise settings, operational combat radius had increased to 750 miles. Some missions pushed 800. This wasn't theoretical. These were actual combat missions, flown daily, documented in squadron records. The 475th Fighter Group, the unit that had learned directly from Lindbergh, was flying missions that covered over 2,000 miles, 10.5 hours in the cockpit. Targets that had been strategically unreachable in June were being hit routinely by August. The impact on Japanese defensive planning was immediate. Their air bases at Seram, Halmahera, and the Palau Islands had been positioned based on calculated P-38 range. American fighters simply couldn't reach them with enough fuel margin to fight and return. That calculation became obsolete overnight. Japanese commanders filed intelligence reports noting that American P-38 seconds were appearing over targets that should have been beyond their radius. They adjusted their defensive dispositions accordingly, pulling fighters back from forward positions, concentrating forces at bases farther from Allied airfields. But the range increase kept coming. By late August, as more pilots refined the technique and grew comfortable with the extended endurance, mission profiles that would have been suicidal in June became standard operating procedure. The 3rd Attack Group, flying B-25 Mitchell bombers against targets in the Netherlands East Indies, suddenly had P-38 escort for strikes they'd been flying alone all summer. Bomber losses dropped dramatically. The fuel technique's success created operational possibilities that reshaped MacArthur's advance toward the Philippines. Long-range strikes against Japanese shipping could be escorted by fighters that stayed with the bombers the entire mission instead of turning back at the fuel halfway point. Photo reconnaissance. Lightnings could push deeper into Japanese-held territory, bringing back intelligence that had been unobtainable. Fighter sweeps could hit enemy airfields before raids, destroying Japanese interceptors on the ground rather than fighting them in the air over the target. The human cost of the extended missions was real. 9 hours in a P-38 cockpit was punishing. 10 hours was brutal. Pilots developed chronic back problems. Some needed help climbing out of their aircraft after landing. On October 14, 1944, a pilot from the 432nd Fighter Squadron celebrated his 24th birthday with an 8-hour escort mission to Balikpapan, Borneo. When he touched down, He was so cramped, his crew chief had to climb up and physically help him out of the cockpit. But the alternative was worse. Shorter missions meant leaving bombers unprotected. It meant turning back from targets with bombs still loaded because fuel margins wouldn't allow pressing the attack. It meant writing off entire categories of targets as unreachable. The discomfort of extended endurance was a price every pilot was willing to pay for the capability it bought. Not everyone benefited equally. The technique worked brilliantly in the Pacific, where ambient temperatures were high, but combat altitudes were generally below 20,000 feet. The P-38's intercooler system, even the problematic early models, could handle the heat at those altitudes. But in Europe, where combat routinely occurred above 25,000 feet in temperatures far below zero, the same settings didn't translate as effectively. European P-38 units experimented with Lindbergh's technique, but found the improvements less dramatic. This was one reason the P-38 remained dominant in the Pacific while being phased out in Europe. The Lightning's strengths, particularly its range, were amplified by operational techniques optimized for Pacific conditions. In Europe, the P-51 Mustang's superior fuel efficiency, getting 3.3 miles per gallon compared to the P-38's optimized 2.6, combined with better high-altitude maneuverability, made it the preferred escort fighter by late 1944. The institutional response to Lindbergh's innovation was complicated. On one hand, he'd solved a critical operational problem that Army Air Force's engineering hadn't addressed. The official cruise settings in the P-38 technical manual were conservative, designed to maximize engine life and minimize risk. That made sense in peacetime or training. In combat, where mission success and pilot survival often depended on having enough fuel to deal with the unexpected, those conservative settings were costing lives and limiting operational capability. On the other hand, Lindbergh was a civilian with no official authority, teaching military pilots to operate their aircraft contrary to established procedures. If something had gone wrong, if engines had started failing catastrophically due to his recommendations, the institutional liability would have been enormous. The fact that his technique worked, and worked brilliantly, didn't eliminate the uncomfortable reality that it had been implemented outside official channels. The technical manual was eventually updated. By early 1945, revised P-38 operational procedures officially incorporated lower RPM, higher manifold pressure cruise settings for long-range missions. The language was carefully worded to avoid directly crediting Lindbergh, instead framing the changes as results of ongoing engineering analysis and operational testing. But everyone who'd been in the Pacific in summer 1944 knew where the technique had come from. The broader lesson was harder to institutionalize. Lindbergh's success demonstrated that combat conditions reveal limitations in equipment and procedures that testing never catches. The people closest to the operational problem, in this case the pilots flying the missions, often understand what needs to change before engineers and planners back home. But military organizations, particularly in wartime, struggle to balance the need for standardization and control against the value of field innovation. The P-38 fuel technique succeeded because junior officers were willing to bend rules and senior commanders were willing to overlook the bending. Colonel MacDonald let a civilian fly combat missions without proper authorization. General Kenny, after the fact, approved continuation of activities that technically violated multiple regulations. That kind of practical flexibility, choosing mission effectiveness over procedural purity, is what allowed rapid adaptation. But it's also the kind of thing that gives staff officers heart attacks. Post-war analysis of the Pacific Air Campaign consistently highlighted improved P-38 range as a critical factor in American air superiority during the advance toward the Philippines. The ability to escort bombers deep into Japanese-held territory, to conduct fighter sweeps against enemy airfields at previously unreachable distances, to provide air cover for amphibious landings from bases hundreds of miles away. All of this became possible because of a fuel management technique developed by a civilian contractor and propagated through informal pilot networks before official channels ever approved it. Charles Lindbergh received no official recognition for this contribution. He couldn't. Acknowledging that a civilian had been flying combat missions, shooting down enemy aircraft, and fundamentally changing fighter operations would have created political problems nobody wanted. His role remained classified for years. The official histories of the 475th Fighter Group and 5th Air Force mentioned improved fuel management techniques, but rarely named Lindbergh as the source. The pilots knew, the mechanics knew. The guys who'd been there, flying those missions, watching their fuel gauges with new confidence, they knew exactly who'd made it possible. When the 475th Fighter Group held reunions in the decades after the war, Lindbergh's name came up constantly. He was the civilian who'd shown up out of nowhere, flown with them like he'd been doing it all his life, and given them back hundreds of miles of operational range. In 1974, the 475th planned a reunion in Dayton, Ohio. Lindbergh had been invited and planned to attend. Teddy Hanks, who'd flown with the 433rd Fighter Squadron in the summer of 1944, was looking forward to meeting Lindbergh again. He wanted to apologize for treating him rudely when Lindbergh first arrived at Hollandia. Hanks had been one of the skeptics, dismissive of the civilian who thought he could teach fighter pilots their business. But a few weeks before the reunion, Lindbergh learned he had terminal cancer. He returned to his home in Hawaii and died on August 26, 1974, at age 72. He was buried in a plain wooden coffin on his property on Maui. Teddy Hanks never got to apologize. Years later, he wrote that Lindbergh had contributed more to the 475th Fighter Group, indeed to the entire 5th Air Force, than any other individual, because he'd enabled American aircraft to reach targets and return that were considered too distant prior to his arrival. The technique Lindbergh taught lived on long after his death. P-38 pilots continued using his cruise settings through the end of the war. By August 1945, when P-38 seconds flew from the Philippines to the Netherlands East Indies, a distance of 2,300 miles, establishing the long-distance record for a World War II combat fighter, they were using fuel management procedures that traced directly back to Lindbergh's work in summer 1944. The irony is profound. Lindbergh had been denied military service by the Roosevelt administration because of his pre-war isolationist politics and perceived Nazi sympathies. He'd testified against American entry into the war, resigned his commission in the Army Air Corps Reserve rather than serve under Roosevelt, spent years as a political pariah. And then, as a civilian contractor, he'd flown 50 combat missions and changed the operational capability of America's most important long-range fighter, more than most generals ever accomplished. He did it not through authority or rank or official channels, but through simple mechanical understanding. He looked at an engine, studied how it actually worked rather than how the manual said to operate it, and recognized that there was substantial operational capability being left on the table because of conservative engineering assumptions. He tested his theory, proved it worked, and taught anyone willing to listen. The resistance he encountered wasn't institutional malice or bureaucratic stubbornness. It was the natural human response to someone suggesting you've been doing something wrong. The pilots who initially rejected Lindbergh's technique weren't stupid or hidebound. They'd been trained extensively on proper engine operation. They'd internalized the connection between following procedures and staying alive. Abandoning those procedures based on a civilian's recommendation, no matter how famous, required real courage. The pilots who adopted the technique first were the ones who'd been most frustrated by existing limitations. They'd turned back from missions one too many times. They'd sweated fuel margins one too many flights. For them, Lindbergh's offer of more range, more operational flexibility, more margin for error, was worth the psychological discomfort of changing how they flew. By late August 1944, that discomfort had disappeared. The technique had proven itself in hundreds of missions. Engines that should have failed, according to the old assumptions, were running perfectly. Pilots who'd been worried about valve damage or detonation had logged enough hours on the new settings to trust them completely. What had been controversial in June was standard operating procedure by September. The speed of that transformation, from rejected innovation to universal adoption in roughly 8 weeks, demonstrates something important about how change happens in combat. In peacetime, new procedures move through formal testing, evaluation, approval, dissemination. That process takes months or years. In combat, good ideas validated by survival spread at the speed of conversation. One pilot tells another. Squadron commanders compare notes. Within weeks, an entire theater has changed how it operates, all through informal networks that bypass official channels entirely. This is both the strength and the danger of combat adaptation. The strength is that effective innovations can propagate incredibly quickly, giving forces an immediate operational advantage. The danger is that bad ideas, untested assumptions, or techniques that work in limited circumstances but fail under other conditions can spread just as fast. The only check is results. If your technique gets people killed, word spreads and everyone stops using it. If it works, everyone adopts it. Natural selection applied to tactics and procedures. Lindbergh's fuel technique survived that selection pressure because it worked consistently across hundreds of pilots and thousands of flight hours. It wasn't a trick that worked for skilled pilots and killed average ones. It wasn't dependent on specific conditions or luck. It was straightforward thermodynamics applied to engine operation. Lower RPM reduced friction and pumping losses. Higher manifold pressure at lower RPM maintained power while improving thermodynamic efficiency. Leaner mixtures reduced fuel consumption. The engines were happy, the fuel lasted longer, everyone went home. The technical manual eventually caught up with reality, but the reality had already been established in combat before the manual acknowledged it. That's backwards from how military organizations prefer to operate. They want procedure updates to flow from testing and engineering analysis, then be implemented in the field after proper evaluation. What happened with the P-38 was the opposite. Field implementation created demonstrated results, forcing the manual to be updated retroactively. Modern military doctrine has tried to institutionalize this kind of bottom-up innovation through rapid fielding initiatives and operational needs processes. The idea is to create formal channels for quickly evaluating and implementing field-developed solutions without waiting for the traditional procurement cycle. But even with those channels, there's tension between the need for standardization and the value of letting people closest to the problem experiment with solutions. The P-38 fuel story is ultimately about trust. Lindbergh had to trust his understanding of engine mechanics enough to fly a technique that contradicted official guidance. MacDonald had to trust Lindbergh enough to let him teach that technique to his pilots. The pilots had to trust the results they were seeing enough to overcome their training. And Kenny had to trust the entire chain enough to make it official policy, despite the procedural irregularities in how it had been developed and implemented. That chain of trust, from individual insight through operational validation to institutional adoption, is how effective innovation happens in wartime. Break any link, and the innovation dies. Lindbergh's insight goes nowhere if MacDonald won't let him fly. MacDonald's willingness to experiment means nothing if pilots won't try the technique. Pilots, adopting it locally doesn't change the war if Kenny doesn't make it theater-wide policy. By November 1944, when MacArthur's forces invaded the Philippines, P-38 Lightnings were ranging across the entire archipelago, escorting bombers, conducting fighter sweeps, providing air support for ground troops, all at distances that would have been impossible 4 months earlier. The fuel technique that a civilian contractor had taught a single fighter group in June had become standard throughout the Pacific by autumn. The strategic impact is hard to quantify precisely, but certain things became possible that hadn't been before. Long-range strikes against Japanese oil refineries at Balikpapan could be escorted by fighters that stayed with the bombers for 8 hours. Photo reconnaissance missions penetrated deep into Japanese-held territory, bringing back intelligence that shaped invasion planning. Fighter sweeps destroyed Japanese aircraft on distant airfields before they could interfere with American operations, all because P-38 seconds could now fly 200 extra miles and still come home. How many bomber crews survived because their escorts didn't have to turn back? How many missions succeeded because fighters could press attacks instead of conserving fuel? How many Japanese aircraft were destroyed on the ground by fighters that could reach bases previously considered safe? The answers exist somewhere in after-action reports and unit histories, but they're difficult to isolate. What's certain is that American air superiority in the Pacific became absolute during the period when improved P-38 range was being fully exploited. Charles Lindbergh never wrote extensively about his time in the Pacific. His wartime journals mention the flights, the combat, the technical work with the P-38, but in characteristically understated language. He didn't claim credit for changing fighter operations. He presented it as collaborative problem-solving, pilots and mechanics, working together to get more capability out of their aircraft. That humility was probably strategic. By 1944, Lindbergh understood that his political reputation made him controversial. Taking credit for military innovations would have invited criticism from people who believed a civilian, particularly one who'd opposed the war initially, had no business influencing combat operations. Better to stay quiet, let the results speak for themselves, and avoid becoming the story. But the pilots who flew with him, the ones who adopted his technique and used it to come home from missions that should have been suicide runs, they knew what he'd contributed, and they talked about it for the rest of their lives. At reunions, in interviews, in memoirs written decades later, the men of the 475th Fighter Group consistently credited Lindbergh with giving them the range to do their jobs and survive. That might be the truest measure of impact, not medals or official recognition or entries in the history books, just the knowledge of the people who were there, who lived the problem and saw the solution work, who understood exactly what difference it made when you could fly 750 miles instead of 570. For them, Lindbergh's contribution was simple and profound. He gave them miles, and in the Pacific, where distance was measured in fuel and fuel was measured in life or death, those extra miles meant everything. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.